In the previous sessions, we used test-driven development to explore high-level design of an application and then application flow, not paying much attention to detail implementation. We reached a point where it became obvious what type of functionality will be needed. We need to keep a list of cyclists and maintain unique identifiers. We are now going to use test-driven development to dive into that detail and develop the functionality. So the first thing I'm going to do is I would like to describe the functionality around maintaining a list of cyclists in the server object. Firstly, I'm gonna want to be able to find a cyclist by ID, because we discovered that that is one of the elements needed when we want to get the status of the group back up. I'm going to leave it empty because I know the cyclist spec, we never really looked at how we're going to implement the ID. So we're going to start by doing that. This can stay as is, but we need a bit more than that. We need to know that the cyclist ID must be unique. So we're going to have one cyclist and a second cyclist, and we're going to expect that the first cyclist ID not to equal the second cyclist ID, and immediately we're in red. So now we need to build a bit more functionality on this side to maintain a static variable in the class, and here I need the constructor ID to be incremented, and this dot ID equals this dot constructor ID, and that is now in green. And just to make sure, I want the IDs to be sequential. So I want ID 1, let's rather make it ID 2 to be ID 1 plus 1. And we're still on green. Now we are ready to add, I'm going to change that to get a cyclist by ID, and we're going to need a GPS server, and we're going to need to log in a cyclist, and then we're going to want the cyclist back by get cyclist by ID, and pass it the cyclist ID, and immediately we're on red, so we'll stop and going to the GPS server. The first thing we're going to need is, of course, this helper method, we're gonna pass the cyclist ID, and we'll start, well, it's gone green, so we can return back to the spec code, and we're going to expect the cyclist.id to equal cyclist ID. Now we're definitely going to need an array, so let's call it array of cyclists, and that will be a new array. Now I'm going to change that just to cyclists. We don't need to, we know it's an array. Obviously when we create the cyclist, we need to add it to this array. So cyclists.push, and this cyclist object that we've created, and here we'll iterate through that array, and we'll say if cyclists index dot id equals the cyclist ID, then we'll return this cyclist, else we'll return undefined. And we're back on green. At the same time, I'd like to find a cyclist by name, because up to now we haven't considered someone logging in twice. So it'll be very similar to there, only I want to find the cyclist by name, and obviously I'll use the same name. And now that method doesn't exist, so we'll add that quickly. And by name and cyclist name. Now obviously we're gonna iterate through the list of cyclists, and if the cyclist name is the one passed in, we'll return it. Now we still have a few problems because we never really implemented cyclist name, so I'm just gonna expect it here, name to be defined, and here I'm gonna call it unknown for now, so that it displays as unknown when someone calls it up. And obviously the login side will now change this to first look for a cyclist by name, and then if the cyclist is undefined, then we'll create the cyclist, set the name to the name that was passed in, add it to the list and return the ID, and we're immediately on green because now the name is taken into account. I'm going to implement the same type of functionality for group, the ID and find group by name and find a group for a cyclist, but I'm going to edit that out to save some time on the video. I now have the functionality for the groups, so get group by name, find a group for a cyclist, join a group for a cyclist. Next, I need to update my position. Previously we used dummy data, so I'm going to go over to the parser, and where I originally thought I'll start with enemy A, I'm not going to. I'm going to use decimal coordinates parser and parse, let's just call it parse. So my parser, just get rid of all of this, is decimal coordinate parser. Of course I need to new that up, and we should be on red, and we are. So without any hesitation, I'm going to throw away previous decisions and previous assumptions. I don't get attached to these decisions so that I can remake them quickly. So although we should be on green, so I should stop. So I'm going to call parser.parse and longitude 10, latitude 20. We should still be on green, yes. So I'm going to expect the parser dot latitude to equal 10, and now we'll be on red. First I want the coordinates to equals the sentence dot split, and we'll split on a comma, and then of course this dot latitude equals parse float coordinates 0, and we're on green, and I'll expect the longitude to equal 20, and we're on red, and longitude to equal second element, and we're on green. I'm going to carry these changes all the way through to GPS server and edit that out again to save time, and when we come back we'll look at rendering the group status. I've implemented the update position functionality and completed the application flow all the way to logging out the first cyclist and retrieving the status so that only the second cyclist status is shown. What's important is if you add up all the video time and the edit time, then we are about 5 hours into the project, and we've got a full suite of specifications covering the application. And even though the last bit of code was a bit of a rush and it's a bit messy, a bit long in one object, I can refactor it now in safety, and all that remains is to build in a persistence layer and call it from a front end to display these numbers. And we will explore that in subsequent sessions.